In Washington today, Donald Trump Jr. submitted to 5 hours of questioning from the Senate Judiciary Committee staff about his meeting in Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, with 4 Russians and a British escort of those Russians, along with Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort. All we really know about that Judiciary Committee session today is what Donald Trump Jr. said in his prepared opening remarks to the committee, which have been made public. It is a 1,776-word statement, and it is the tip of the iceberg of the thousands and thousands and thousands of words that were said today in those 5 hours. Opening statements for congressional testimony are usually the least interesting part of the testimony. Donald Trump Jr.'s statement glossed over many details of the meeting, including who was actually in the room. He referred to only 7 of the 8 people in the room and named only 6 of them. You can be sure that during the questioning, Donald Trump Jr. was pressed repeatedly on exactly who was in that room and exactly who did what in that room and exactly who said exactly what in that room. It is very likely that the committee staff's questioning provoked more than one version of an answer to various points that were raised today. Donald Trump Jr.'s opening statement says he does not recall any phone conversations with Emin Agalarov, a Russian singer who helped arrange that meeting but was not present at that meeting. But Donald Trump Jr.'s phone records indicate that he had 3 phone calls with Emin Agalarov on June 6th and June 7th, when the meeting was being arranged. You can be absolutely sure that more than one of the Senate committee staff who questioned Donald Trump Jr. today repeatedly questioned him about those phone calls from every possible angle. If Donald Trump Jr. was speaking slowly, it would take him only 15 minutes to tell the committee the word-for-word story that he tells in his opening statement. If he just sat there and read every word of it, 15 minutes maximum. But he was in the room for 5 hours. 5 hours. That tells you how unimportant his opening statement was compared to everything else that was said in that room that we don't know about. And so as you read articles and reports about what Donald Trump Jr. said in that room, remember, those are based only on the first 15 minutes of what happened in that room. Those reports leave out nearly 5 hours of material that the transcript of that meeting will contain. But the opening statement was not nothing. The opening statement tells us what Donald Trump Jr. wanted us to know about that meeting, and it tells us what Donald Trump Jr. doesn't want us to know about that meeting. The opening statement also shows us possible conflicts with Donald Trump Jr.'s earlier public statements about the meeting. For example, Congressman Adam Schiff, after reading that statement, Congressman Adam Schiff, he's part of the House Intelligence Committee's investigation. He said today, this statement contains a notable omission in that it no longer mentions that President Trump knew nothing of the meeting or these events, raising questions about whether then candidate Trump was in fact knowledgeable about the meeting in advance. Joining us now, Mieke Eoyang, former House Intelligence Committee staff member, and Ron Klain, former Chief of Staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. And he is also, this is important tonight, former Chief Counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Ron, I want to start with you with your Judiciary Committee experience. Take us in that room. We know that the staff asked all the questions. There were about 5 senators, mostly Democrats, who visited the room for some periods of time during the questioning. But what do you see in the Donald Trump Jr. statement, and what do you expect was going on during those 5 hours?
Yeah, you know, I think the hot air on Capitol Hill today was a Category 5 cover-up from Donald Trump Jr. And I say Category 5 cover-up because today's story is the 5th different story he's told about the Trump Tower meeting. Last summer, he said it showed a lack of moral compass on the Clinton campaign to suggest that he might have worked with the Russians. In March, he said he had never met with Russians. When that was proven untrue, he and his father cooked up the statement that said that the meeting was about adoption policy. And then when the emails came out that showed that the meeting was really set up because the Russian government wanted to help the Trump campaign, and Donald Trump Jr. said, I love that. He said the meeting was about DNC donations. And finally today he said it was about trying to assess the fitness of Hillary Clinton to be president. So I think what happened in that room today was rigorous questioning by the professional staff and a lot of Democratic senators popping in and out to test his credibility. And what you heard at the end of it was those senators saying, hey, we want this guy back here in open session for the public to see this, for open questions, and that shows they were not persuaded by the credibility of Donald Trump Jr.
Let's listen to what Senator Richard Blumenthal said. He was one of the senators who was in that room during some of the questions.
There is no basis right now to conclude whether there was collusion or not, or whether there was obstruction of justice or not. And that is the remaining area of the investigation that needs to be fully explored. We are a ways from drawing any conclusions.
Mieke, the senator obviously not willing to reveal anything of what actually went on in that room.
That's right. In fact, the Senate Judiciary Committee is playing a game of prisoner's dilemma with the various people who were involved in this Trump Tower meeting. They don't want them to know what the others are saying, and will interview them separately and then compare stories. So this is really a fact-gathering mission. They have a lot of information to get through. And remember, they talked to Jared Kushner already about that meeting earlier this summer, so they have his testimony in closed session to compare it to.
And they also have a sense of Donald Trump Jr.'s credibility going into that room. Let's listen to what he said to Sean Hannity on July 11th.
I just want the truth to get out there. I mean, that's part of why I released all this stuff today.
As far as this incident is concerned, this is all of it.
This is everything. This is everything.
And Ron Klain, every day after that, for several days, there was much more every day that was revealed, including much more about the emails that set up that meeting. It was not everything. When he said that to Sean Hannity, he knew it was not everything. That is video of Donald Trump Jr. not telling the truth about this story.
And not the only video, Lawrence. As I said, he's changed his story on this 5 times. And one of those times was, as we now know, a statement written on Air Force One by the President of the United States that can only be described as an effort to mislead the American people, perhaps to try to mislead Bob Mueller, perhaps to try to mislead these congressional committees. And so there are a lot of hard questions to be asked. And I think when you heard the Democratic senators say at the end of this session today, you know, we want this in open session. We want to question him. We want people to see what he looks like when he's being questioned. That's a big tell, Lawrence. They tried to keep it close to the vest, but it's a big tell that they don't think he's telling the truth, and they think that in a public session, the American people would also have questions about Don Jr.'s credibility.
And Mieke, it's such an important point that Ron is making, is that when senators say they really want to hear from someone in public, it is because they believe there will be something communicated by this witness in more than just the words the witness says.
Yes, that's true. They want the American people to see this person's demeanor, to be able to assess whether or not they think he's lying. Now, remember, these senators have seen him in closed session, and one of the senators, Senator Coons, after the meeting, posted the statutory reference to lying to Congress, which is a criminal statute. It says if you lie to Congress, you can go to jail. So he was very concerned after this meeting that perhaps they had been lied to. Now, they have the opportunity to see all the different stories that have been told over this period of time, but this story, there are criminal consequences for telling a lie.
Yeah, Ron, big difference between this and being on Sean Hannity. And these are the moments that not everyone's ready for, to put it mildly. I'm sure you've seen witnesses at the Judiciary Committee at different times who don't really understand how they have to present themselves in situations like this.
Yes, and of course, if you keep changing your story, it's hard to keep your story straight. And I think Don Jr. has that problem as well as the problem of trying to protect his father, the president, which clearly he's doing, protect potentially or be thrown under the bus by his brother-in-law, one of the president's closest advisors. So this is a very, very complicated situation. And I think we are still many weeks or months away from all the truth coming out.
And Mieke, there are strong indications that the special prosecutor is pursuing the information about public statements that were made about this meeting by Donald Trump Jr. and the president's involvement in those statements. We know that the president was out of the country at the time. There was a small group with him that were on Air Force One as they were working on this, and there are indications that the special prosecutor wants to talk to those people who worked on the statement and that wants to know about the president's involvement. What do you make of that particular line of investigation?
I think it shows that Mueller is serious in this obstruction of justice investigation, and he's talking to all the people involved. And the question is whether or not you think all the people will maintain the same story. The same is true of this Trump Tower meeting. Now, there were a few people in that meeting that the Trump organization can't control. For one, this translator who's worked for the U.S. government before. If that person is forthcoming about what he remembers in the meetings to the Mueller or to the congressional investigators, he may tell a story that's very different than what you're hearing orchestrated by the president on Air Force One.
Mieke, Eoyang, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.